All right, a month ahead of the Glasgow Climate Summit, Joe Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, he went out and lavished praise on Chinese President Xi Jinping for promising to stop building coal plants overseas. According to Kerry, the move showed that China was being serious about climate change and becoming a positive player in reducing emissions. Now, sadly for Kerry and all his well-heeled allies at COP26, it turns out that when it comes to carbon, the Chinese Communist Party isn't lifting a finger. First, Bloomberg has reported overnight that China's daily coal production has reached a multi-year high of almost 12 million tonnes. That means China's producing as much coal in 9 days as the big miner Glencore produces in an entire year. 9 days versus an entire year. But the bad news doesn't stop there. In a bombshell report, the Washington Post, as I said at the top of the show, has revealed that China has only officially reported its emissions 4 times in the last 30 years, with its most recent report far back as 7 years ago in 2014. In other words, what Beijing says it's emitting is a long way off what it is actually emitting. Graham Lloyd is the environment editor at the Australian newspaper. He joins me now from Sydney. Well, Graham, I'll ask you more about the Washington Post yarn in a moment, but before I do, how can anyone take seriously anything Beijing says? And if we can't trust the world's biggest emitters, how can anyone argue that our emissions reduction framework has rigour?
Well, this cuts right to the heart of it, Peter. The data that's being put out by many countries all over the world is completely inadequate. The report from the Post that you mentioned at the top of the show shows that the discrepancy lies somewhere between the entire emissions of the United States at the low end or the entire emissions of China at the top end. There's very little rigour that goes into measuring what is happening in these places, and I think the China example is a perfect one. We have a real live example where measures of fluorocarbons from China were falsely reported for years and years as well. So I think people have always had great questions to ask about the economic data and performance of China, and I think in this area it's no different at all.
We know we have concerns about China and their growth data, their economic growth data. We know we have concerns about China reporting its human rights record, and now we've got similar concerns about their environmental numbers here. 7 years. There's been no commitment. I mean, how can you create a COP26 climate plan, an emissions reduction plan out of Glasgow, when cleanly 1/3 of emissions aren't even in the room? The player China didn't turn up, but nor can you have any sort of comfort that the numbers you have are even a ballpark accurate figure. I mean, the one lesson I learned in politics, the first time I touched a policy document, is if you can't measure it, you can't change it. And the issue here is you can't measure China.
Well, you can't measure China and you can't measure large parts of the developing world. And it's trite to say, but in the scheme of things, in these sort of numbers, Australia is very much a rounding error. And so if we look at what contribution we can make to this, one is in technological developments that might help. And the other is verification to actually make sure people understand exactly what is happening. This is right across the whole of the developing world, through the forest systems, through the emissions targets, through everywhere. I think the COP meeting that's taking place now has really collided with reality on this issue. John Kerry has been trying to get people to the table to make promises, and then Barack Obama's turned up at the meeting and said basically, look, I've apologised that Donald Trump left, and then I'm really angry that China and India aren't coming now. So the whole thing at the very top end is really struggling for relevance.
I won't get into any more detail. You've gone through, I think, very well there, the actual, the real emissions and what could be, well, certainly what's reported and what we think they could be on the basis of that Washington Post article. But what also in the article struck me as interesting was a whole debate about carbon offsets. And we've got a country in Central Africa basically saying, well, all of our land is fabulous. pay us to offset your emissions, claiming that one small country alone can offset the emissions of Russia. I mean, it's just not plausible.
And this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where I've actually been and had the pleasure of tripping around. It's a place that is deeply rooted in corruption and completely a failed state. So it's not surprising that they would see this. I mean, the other example that was included in the report was Malaysia, saying that its forests absorb CO2 at 4 times the rate of neighbouring forests in Indonesia. So there's no rigour in the whole measurement of these things. So it's really, that is the process that needs to be the foundation on which action is built. And what we're seeing is probably going in the other direction, where the developed world is saying, well, how do we really line up the developed world to sell us offsets so we can keep doing what we're doing?
All right, let's go today to the Prime Minister's EV, electric vehicle strategy, future fuels, he calls it. Let's put aside the cost of electric cars, because I think they're out of the ballpark for most families in Australia at this stage. I'm sure they'll come down. But $250 million on the table from the federal government to drive investment in charging stations. And they want to lift the current level of EVs, under 2% of cars sold, to something close to around 2 million by 2030. I get all of that. But just the mechanics of people literally, all plugging in at night when they get home from work to charge their car up the next day, what's it going to do to the grid? We know the grid's already not great in terms of reliability. We know we've got a higher proportion and growing of renewables. We know, sure, wind blows at night, but the sun doesn't shine at night. How's it all supposed to add up?
And I think this is really the core to analyse the government's approach. The government have been under a lot of pressure from the electric car industry to provide subsidies to make cars cheaper. The government said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to spend our money making sure that if people buy them, as they probably will, they'll be able to charge them, and that when they do charge them, it's not going to blow up the electricity grid. So a lot of that money is going to be on infrastructure, transmission lines, ways to vary the charging for electricity to encourage people to only use it at certain times and to use their car batteries to back up the grid. It's a really big engineering challenge, and that's obviously the government's priority, to make sure that can be at least looked at. I thought a very important part of the government's announcement was they're not only talking about battery cars. There was a big emphasis there on hydrogen cars. And given that Australia is looking at a hydrogen industry, the Prime Minister made the announcement at a hydrogen fuelling facility in Melbourne. That's quite a different technology to batteries. It's quicker to charge. It doesn't put the impact on the grid. So I think there'll be a lot more action in that space.
Well, we'll see, won't we? Graham, Lloyd, thank you as always.
Thank you.